barely a month ago now that I did a video on Postal 4, the third game in Running with Scissors Postal series, and a bunch of games that really seem to have mastered the art of being so bad that they're good.
Get the hell out of here, you lunatic!
Well, this time I'm looking at something a little bit different. I mean, it's still a Postal game, kind of, only it's now been developed by Hyperstrange, and instead of being a janky, semi-open world shooter, it's a janky boomer shooter. Yeah, instead of being stranded in some backwater town in the arse crack of America, the Postal dude's now stranded in his own head, with 3 chapters and a dozen or so odd levels taking place entirely in his deranged mind.
Yeah, that seems perfectly logical.
And after having finished the whole thing a couple of times, I gotta say, it's actually pretty good, most of the time.
I did you.
It just kind of feels like it often can't decide if it wants to be an arena shooter or a more standard key hunt through levels with fixed enemy placements, being a combination of the two that only really seems to work half the time. It's definitely nailed the way that the movement feels though, and I was actually kind of surprised just how smooth and slick the game is to control. From things like fast weapon swapping through to slide jumping. Yeah, slide jumping, and look, if you're going to play this thing, first things first. Bind that slide button to shift. By default, it's bound to control because it's also shared with crouching, but pressing that button when you're moving is going to instead cause you to slide. Then if you press jump during that slide, you can launch yourself in that direction, you know, forward, backwards, or sideways, and it becomes the closest thing you've got to a dash move in the game, which also happens to have no cooldown, you know, allowing you to essentially bunny hop around. I feel like the game kind of understates how important this thing is because jumping around like this really minimizes the damage you take, but it also just kind of helps you get around the levels faster, some of which are pretty damn huge in size and devoid of action entirely. And it really kind of pains me that there's going to be people out there who aren't playing the game this way. Speaking of, you know, if you do want to pick this thing up, which I do ultimately recommend, make sure to use my affiliate link on goodoldgames.com. In fact, you might even get a discount on top of an already reduced price, which is, you know, even better.
Okay, Boomer.
Now, I think there is some kind of overarching story here about the dude chasing down his evil doppelganger after he's fallen asleep watching TV, but there's not really anything major connecting these levels together in a narrative sense.
There's something really, really wrong here.
You start off in suburbia, or at least the dude's vision of suburbia, an idyllic neighborhood where houses are lined with green grass and white picket fences, and the neighbors are all armed with double-barreled shotguns, and every mutt in the area wants to gnaw your face off. The civilians are portrayed as these faceless, hysterical nobodies that run around doing their best to get in harm's way, and you are kind of encouraged to kill them here, as they always drop incremental health and armor pickups.
Dog goes woof, gun goes blam.
Then after that, you'll also move through a prison, a mental hospital, some spooky forests, and even a gaming convention, ending up in space for the final showdown against the dude's doppelganger. This incarnation of the dude is voiced by Corey Cruz, who voices him from that one other game that we don't really speak of. Here though, he drops a whole heap of one-liners like a regular old Duke Nukem.
Now that is amazing grace.
It features the typical kind of writing and content that you'd expect, so, you know, lots of toilet humor and sex jokes. I mean, there's a level where you're fighting alongside the war between Mexico and the US, and I swear to God there's been border hopping jokes in every single Postal game ever made.
Doc, I keep seeing mutilated corpses.
Though I do think it is kind of funny though that throughout this level and then for the rest of the game, both the Mexican and the US enemies are always infighting. And the background jingle throughout all of this is a whistled rendition of the Mexican hat dance because, yeah, of course it is. But I mean, look, would it really be a Postal game if it didn't have some crappy jingle on loop in the background over and over? Yeah, I didn't think so. I do think though that some of it does feel a little bit dated, like there's a whole toilet paper motif they've got going on here, you know, I guess in kind of reference to the early days of the COVID epidemic, but I mean at this point that's what, like 2 years old now?
Okay, Boomer.
If that's not enough, there's an entire boss that's literally just COVID, literally. Another earlier boss is called Karen, and it just kind of feels like a joke that's come a couple of years too late. And yeah, I know, that's ironic coming from someone like me, the same guy who still uses Tourette's guy clips in his videos.
Pass.
How about that whole level that's set in what's very clearly supposed to be E3? And again, like, they haven't even run E3 since 2019. But again, like, aren't we all kind of past making fun of E3 at this point?
No.
There's an enemy which is basically just Siren Head, and go check out the date that that video first went viral on YouTube as well. Yeah, exactly. The only thing which is kind of still relevant is how the last chapter in the game makes numerous references to Elon Musk, and one of the enemy types here is literally just a sentient space truck. And again, yeah, when were those things first getting talked about? There is still quite a lot I think the game does right here. I mean, stylistically, I think it looks awesome. And there is some pretty neat symbolism here and there. You know, like I see the NPCs being faceless is a bit of a way of showing how the dude perceives society and how detached he feels from other people. During the level set inside the asylum, the walls are all warped and shifted, almost like you've stumbled into a homage to Constantine's mansion from Thief. And I kind of think you could view that as the horrific and painful ways that he remembers his time in institutional care. You know, or that he was just doped out of his mind at the time on pharmaceutical drugs. As you pass the staff room, there's all these grabby hands coming out of the walls to latch onto you, which, I don't know, might even suggest a history of abuse when he was in care as well. I mean, it's not like this stuff is all that relevant or really even that meaningful, but I kind of like that the attention to detail is there if you want to go looking for it. Later on, there's a level set inside what's really just the Death Star from Star Wars Episode 4, along with fighting these very xenomorph-looking enemies, and ironically, a level that's influenced by like a 40-something-year-old film feels like it's aged better than that other content in the game. It also kind of reminds me a fair bit of that old South Park first-person shooter that came out a few years ago, which is kind of funny to say considering Postal has an enemy that spawns in these chattering toy monkeys, which is almost identical to another enemy spawner in South Park. But you don't care about any of that stuff, do ya? All you want to know is how fun it is to shoot shit. Well, on that front I can say pretty confidently that, yeah, it's good. And I think Brain Damage's biggest plus is that it somehow makes familiar weapons seem unique, well, mostly.
They mostly only come every few years. Mostly.
What I mean is that while these are guns you've seen and used before, you know, like pistol and assault rifle archetypes, it does kind of seem like they've tried really hard here to make them feel different, from the way they look visually through to the way that they behave. The first weapon is the dude's shovel. It was iconic to the Postal game as the crowbar is to Half-Life or the chainsaw is to Doom. And I kind of like too how it's the dude's vision of an ideal shovel, you know, being his dream and all, which I guess explains why it's got chainsaw blades and is completely motorized. However, unlike Doom's chainsaw, this thing doesn't stagger enemies who are hit by it. Yeah, remember how back in Doom, how when you'd push this thing into a pinky demon's face, they were pretty much helpless to fight back, which, you know, is the one reason why that weapon was actually decent. Yeah, well, that's just not a thing here, and you're still wide open to incoming damage. Ow. So about all it's good for is killing NPCs, or the odd couple of times you actually have to use it to progress. Ow. Oh. Moving on, we've got the pistol, which actually does pretty decent damage on its own, to the point that it can carry you for pretty much the entire game. Then it has an alternate fire mode that locks onto 3 nearby enemies and fires off automatically. Though to be honest, I'd argue that you're better off just shooting something 3 times yourself. And I think it takes about the same amount of time, if not less. So again, it's a mode that I just didn't really find myself using. Yeah, and it kind of feels like a bit of a familiar mechanic. I mean, where have I seen that recently? As for the shotgun, well, it's really just Doom Eternal's super shotgun. I mean, there's no two ways about it. In every sense of the word, it's the super shotgun. Even down to the meat hook, which locks onto enemies and reels you in. And yeah, look, I know that we all hate every single FPS game being compared to Doom Eternal, but that's something we're all just going to have to get used to moving ahead these days. More so when it's the case of a gun like this, which, like I said, is literally the super shotgun. There's even these sections in between combat where you're grappling from floating point to floating point. Only you kind of needed those in Doom Eternal because it was like giving the player time to catch their breath after a really intense combat sequence. There's not really any combat that gets to that same level in Postal Brain Damage, so it kind of feels more like a needless homage that just ends up making some of these areas feel empty and uninhabited. The other difference with this meat hook though, and where I think they really fucked up, is by not having the meat hook stun whatever it locks onto. Now this was a huge benefit to the super shotgun in Doom Eternal. I mean, it not only lets you close the gap on someone really quickly and then, you know, blast them at close range, but the fact that it stunned them meant you weren't just steamrolling towards oncoming damage. I don't know, it just kind of feels like a bit of a misunderstanding of why the meat hook was so good to Doom Eternal's combat loop, and it really makes this thing just feel like a bit of a cheap knockoff, which, I don't know, I guess it is. Jeez. Otherwise, the shotgun is still pretty fun to use, and there's practically no cooldown time on the hook, meaning you can spam it and zip around all over the place, which is pretty awesome. And I do have to say, overall, as far as shotguns though, this one really does tick all the boxes. It does good damage and it sounds great, able to usually just kill most enemies in a single hit at point blank range, which is exactly what you want.
Next.
Now the nail biter, which is practically your machine gun, is also a pretty interesting weapon. The basic mode fires out nails, obviously, but the ultimate fire, keeping in line with the whole dream motif, fires out an alarm clock, which creates a stop time bubble that catches anything that touches it. And this is where it gets kind of cool, because you can shoot anything into that bubble, and then when that bubble runs out, it'll come face first with whatever's on the other side of it. Later on too, you'll get a Gatling gun, which honestly feels like it does about the same amount of damage as the nail gun, to the point that I can't really see that much of a difference. And instead of that alarm clock, it's got an ultimate fire mode that latches onto a single enemy, and then all shots fired home in onto that one spot. But considering the gun melts most enemies as it is, I just never felt the need to use this thing. I think my favorite though is what's basically a lightning gun called the Brain Fucker. Yeah, that's an actual name. And this thing fires out a constant stream of lightning, but can also send out a smaller hovering brain projectile, which then does AoE damage to nearby enemies. If you shoot that projectile, it also explodes, kind of like the ultimate fire for the shock rifle in the Unreal games. Then as you'd expect, you've also got a rocket launcher, and again, like the shotgun, this thing just feels like it's been balanced to perfection. Firing out a rocket which does just the right amount of damage and also has just the right amount of splash damage as well. The ultimate fire mode though is a bit of a letdown to me. Now it shoots out the most holiest of weapons, the holy hand grenade. You know, the hand grenade that's supposed to blow thine enemies to tiny bits.
With it thou mayst blow thine enemies to tiny bits.
But I don't even think it's really doing that much more damage than the base rockets. As a bit of a combination, I guess, of the crossbow in Half-Life and the bow in the Far Cry games, you've got the Penetrator, which is a hunting bow used to launch precision dildos. Let's say that all out loud together, right? Precision dildos.
Pretty standard, really.
Yeah, truly a weapon to surpass Metal Gear. This thing also makes some pretty suggestive noises when you use it. You know, the kind of suggestive noises that are funny at first, but after a couple of minutes, it just kind of makes you want to turn the sound down.
It's a nightmare for you.
Gotta say though, I'm pretty curious as to where they got this sound effect from, you know, for scientific reasons. Bullshit! It is a bit stupid though how this thing can't go through multiple enemies. I mean, it is called the Penetrator after all. And I think they also missed out on not having a different dildo each time you fire it. You know, kind of like the Celestial Claw in a Medieval. But again, a pretty solid weapon, and damage-wise, perfectly balanced, as all things should be. And that brings me on to the final weapon, the Pussy Blower.
Now I have a ton of pussy.
It appears to be a vacuum cleaner that's in reverse mode that fires out stray cats that shred through enemies, doing actually pretty high damage. Then you can even suck these poor kitties back up again to try to reclaim ammunition, and I'm sure Peter would have a field day with that one. You know what, this thing is just so out of left field, but it does so much damage it is entertaining as fuck to use, so I can't even see any reason to bitch about it. Plus it also kind of keeps in line with the rest of the series, you know, using cats as weapon attachments, so the whole thing connects. But I guess the ultimate weapon in your arsenal is the one the dude's had since he was born, which seems to be the source for an infinite stream here of high pressure piss. The Doomslayer might have had his crucible, but the dude has his meat and tooth veg. And if simply pissing in someone's eyes to distract them ain't enough, because that's a mechanic by the way.
Now let's rock out with my cock out.
You can also swill down various liquids to get added buffs. Like drink hypnotic booze and enemies are going to start infighting. Drink liquid nitrogen and you can turn them into blocks of ice.
What was this game rated again?
Or finally drink hot sauce and piss out a stream of fire, which I guess is about the closest we're ever going to get to being able to kill someone in a video game with gonorrhea.
Burn, baby, burn.
Gonorrhea! Gonorrhea!
There's these wizard-looking enemies who fire out these slow-moving fireballs, and these fireballs seem to have a bit of a weakness to urine, because a simple drop from the old baby maker is going to get rid of these things instantly. Certain doors also require being pissed on to unlock, and you'll need to use your fiery piss to also burn down obstructive bushes. And now I'm just realizing that this is the most times I think I've ever said the word piss so many times so close together. Piss.
Piss!
Overall, it is a pretty deep combat system, way more than just relying on a single weapon and circle strafing around these boring looking environments. There's really useful items like slow motion pills, dual wielding, along with just puffing away on the old crack pipe to regain your health points.
This can't be good for me, but yeah, it really is.
Kind of a shame you can't combine these, like you can't pop some pills and then run around the room like Neo from the Matrix, shooting jets of fire piss into everyone's eyes.
Why not?
The slow motion pills, for instance, turn the game into this wonderfully chaotic, dramatically slowed down slice of carnage. You can really appreciate all the effort that's gone into the gore mechanics and watch enemies get blown apart piece by piece. I mean, it's a thing of beauty. The biggest advice I can give with these items too is if the game is giving you some, it expects you to use them. This is not the kind of game where you want to hoard all this stuff away, and if you come across it, use it. In fact, I think there's some combat areas that are just outright unfair without using these items.
Did we just play catch and you lost?
Somehow they've also managed to shoehorn in a parry system where if you time a kick just right, you can parry a projectile back at an enemy. And I say shoehorn because there's not really any consistency to how it works, and you're probably not going to bother with it when you're being attacked by groups of enemies at once. But the few times you can pull it off and get that ridiculously tight timing spot on, well, it does feel pretty satisfying. But again though, I can't help but think that this mechanic feels kind of familiar. Yet even has that same slow motion effect on impact that Ultra Kill has. Yeah, and I should probably mention too how one of the enemies is basically just a mancubus in a sexy nurse outfit that's also able to revive enemies like an archfire. Or how about these floating head things which shoot out explosive clowns, which are basically pain elementals if the lost souls exploded on impact. Though I don't know what the hell's going on with these enemies you seem to always find in the vents. They're like dominatrix, amputee, blowjob caterpillars or something. I don't know, man. It's some straight up Silent Hill 2 type shit. Now, the problems that I have with Postal brain damage comes from a lot of small, minor wounds, you know, as opposed to giant, gaping ones. For starters, I think there's just an outright inconsistency with health and ammo pickups, especially ammo. Seems you're either almost completely out of ammo in this game or flush with it to the point that you don't even need any of it. The worst thing is when you don't even have ammo for the pistol. I mean, for the player to be out of ammo for such a basic weapon, it's almost the entire point of that weapon existing in the first place, you know, to be a last resort. In between each chapter, of which there's 3, the game takes away your weapons for no reason, and then it's this annoying loop of having to wait for the game to slowly give them all back. I played through the entire thing on hard mode, and hard mode just feels incredibly unbalanced at times, and it's really common to go from having almost full health and armor to dying in seconds from some kind of bullshit attack that just completely blindsided you.
Jeez! Nuclear power. Ow.
Bullshit! The worst offender by far, though, are these Illuminati enemies who fire up this constant stream of energy. It's kind of like the Geonosian elites from Star Wars Republic Commando, and when you've got like 2 or 3 of these guys at once, which happens frequently, you just get melted in seconds. I mean, at that point, you may as well just mash that quick load button and save yourself the hassle. And I mean, you do expect hard mode to be hard, but these kind of deaths just feel cheap to me. What's also not helping is some of these combat arenas, which are just fucking awful. Kind of harks back to what I was saying earlier, how it feels like the game ain't sure if it wants to be an arena shooter like Doom Eternal or Serious Sam, or a more traditional one like Quake. And I think the combat just never really finds a groove in either of those modes.
Holy fuckity fucking fuck.
You'll walk into a giant open area, grab a key or something, and then a bunch of bad guys spawn in to attack you. Enemies move around really quickly and they fire off lots of projectiles, and you're fighting them in these areas which have jump pads scattered around and all that kind of stuff. But then you also have to fight them in these cramped interior environments as well. And it's like making someone fight a pit bull inside a broom closet. But even in these more generously proportioned arena environments, they just don't really work all that well when it tries to emulate that arena style of combat.
Fuck.
This prison area, for instance, is like a giant cylindrical room, and it's just a mess during combat. A bunch of enemies spawn in during a key sequence here, and then they're just coming at you from pretty much every single possible direction. They're getting stuck on jump pads and taking needlessly long routes up these ramps to try to reach a position. And there's just no flow or thought to any of it. It's kind of like getting a jar of bees thrown in your face. So most of the time whenever it was possible, I just tried to bottleneck enemies into a single spot, like a doorway, where they'd then have to funnel in one by one, making it much easier to kill them. And I kind of feel like that when you're almost forced into playing the game that way to get by at times, you know, I just don't think that's very fun. And I sure doubt it's the way the level design is intended for it to be played.
I get the feeling it's going to burn more than once.
The worst though are just all these empty areas of the levels where nothing happens. Some of these levels are pretty damn big and there's sections of them that are just often barely populated. It just kind of feels like filler in between the next combat sequence. You don't even have to look past the opening areas in the game to see this either. You know, that whole first level set in that cutesy 1950s nuclear family suburbia is just the same copy-pasted houses over and over, with almost completely redundant incremental health and armor pickups scattered around the rooms.
No one knows.
Now, I don't know if it's all that relevant, but the guys who made this, Hyperstrange, also made a really underrated game a couple of years ago called Elderborn. Now, this was a first-person Souls-like game, and when this thing first came out, it was also horribly balanced, and also had a bunch of other issues. However, they eventually patched all that stuff out to the point that it was one of my favourite games of the year. I don't know if it's going to be a case of history repeating itself with Postal brain damage, but I can definitely see this being a similar issue because, again, you can see the potential. It's just the whole thing's often brought down a bit by these few niggling issues here and there, which seem to be holding the whole thing back. You know, it's the difference between a game being good and a game being great. And I don't know, maybe they also released it in a slightly unfinished state to kind of mimic what's going on with the main releases in the series. I mean, Postal 4 left early access recently, and it's even a bit of a stretch to say that that thing is finished and polished.
Fresh from the tap.
So if the alarm clock floating above my weapon model is an intentional glitch, well, then I guess that's a work of genius. The difference though is that with those Postal games, you almost kind of expect a sloppy and unfinished product. I mean, they sure as hell made it clear that that's the kind of experience they were going for with Postal 4 if the marketing material was any indication. With brain damage though, I was more hoping for a really tight little boomer shooter. And while I did get slices of that here and there, you know, I was really hoping for the whole pie. But you know what? It's still a recommendation from me at the end of the day.
And that, my dear friend, is only the beginning.
But if you're just looking for another boomer shooter to finish, well, then this one's going to definitely scratch that itch. People hoping for a more complex and refined shooting experience, well, you're just not going to find that one here. But I mean, you know, in a game where you can piss on someone until they die from it, were you ever really expecting that to begin with?